What happens when a machine keeps running long after every warning light has turned red? Right now, that machine is the Russian military, and the cracks are no longer small. Before we go any further, if you care about understanding this war beyond the headlines, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who still thinks Russia is winning easily. Let's get into what is really happening. For years, we have heard the same story. Russia is grinding forward. Russia is patient. Russia can absorb any amount of pain and just keep pushing. That story worked for a while. It explained the slow capture of ruined cities and the endless casualty reports that somehow never seemed to matter. But stories like that only work as long as the numbers behind them still make sense. And right now, the numbers are starting to fall apart. Let's start with the obvious question. What does Russia actually have to show for years of fighting? A handful of destroyed cities, places so badly damaged that occupying them feels less like a victory and more like inheriting a pile of rubble. Yes, holding a shattered city is better than holding open ground in freezing weather. That much is true. But the cost of getting there has been staggering. Some estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of casualties were spent just to secure a handful of devastated urban areas. And ahead of Russia now sit several more heavily fortified cities, each one expected to demand a similar price in blood. Think about that math for a moment. If each major city costs somewhere in the range of 200,000 casualties, and there are still multiple fortress cities left to capture, one after another, not all at once, the total cost could end up doubling everything Russia has already lost in this entire war. That is not a small detail. That is a completely different scale of war than what we saw in the earlier years of this conflict. But here is what makes this moment different from anything before. In the earlier phases of the war, when Russian forces were slowly grinding through other major towns, they did not have the problems they have now. Their fuel refineries were not being hit. Their oil processing capacity was not collapsing. They were not being forced to restrict fuel exports just to keep their own economy from choking. Moscow itself was not being struck on a regular basis. These are new pressures, stacking on top of old ones, and they are stacking fast. At the same time, something quieter but just as dangerous has been happening on the battlefield itself. Russian forces are reportedly losing entire battalions worth of soldiers every single day, regardless of what tactics they try. Day after day, week after week, the losses keep piling up, no matter how the front line shifts. And here's a truth about warfare that has not changed in thousands of years, long before modern tanks or drones ever existed. If you are dug into a defensive position, you have a massive advantage over anyone trying to push you out. A small group of defenders holding solid ground can often outlast an attacking force many times their size. Historically, it might take 3 to 5 attackers to dislodge just one determined defender. Now imagine those attackers are exhausted, poorly supplied, sometimes decades past their physical prime, without proper fuel, without proper food, without proper reinforcement. In open terrain, that math is already brutal for the attacker. Inside a city, surrounded by rubble and hidden defenders, that same math becomes even worse, sometimes requiring 5 times more attackers just to clear a handful of defenders from a single building. This is the trap Russia cannot escape. It is not a strategy problem. It is not a leadership problem that can be solved with a new general or a new plan. It is basic battlefield mathematics, and mathematics does not care about propaganda. It also helps to understand just how much this equation has shifted compared to earlier stages of the war. In the beginning, Russian commanders could still rely on sheer numbers and stockpiled Soviet-era equipment to absorb losses that would break most modern militaries. That stockpile is not infinite. Years of continuous fighting have burned through decades of accumulated tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery shells. What remains increasingly includes older, poorly maintained equipment pulled out of long-term storage, some of it decades past its intended service life. Replacing modern losses with aging reserves is not a sustainable long-term strategy. It buys time, but it does not solve the underlying problem. Now let's talk about the man at the very top, because understanding him is key to understanding where this war might actually end. There is a strange and dangerous contradiction sitting at the center of Russian leadership right now. On one hand, the person in charge appears to receive constantly polished reports suggesting the military situation is stable, even favorable. On the other hand, that same person is reportedly consumed by fear of an internal uprising, obsessed with his own personal security in a way that borders on paranoia. Picture the strange irony of standing deep underground in a secure bunker, surrounded by trusted advisors, while quietly wondering if one of the very people beside you might eventually be the one to move against you. That kind of psychological pressure does not stay hidden forever. It shapes decisions. It shapes who gets promoted, who gets removed, and how much honest information ever reaches the top. History gives us plenty of examples of powerful leaders who found themselves in exactly this kind of position. Long, entrenched rule combined with no clear successor. That combination has ended badly for leaders throughout history, again and again. Naming a clear successor creates its own danger, because it hands ambitious people an obvious target to either support or eliminate. Not naming a successor creates a different danger because the people around you start privately calculating what happens if you suddenly disappear from power. Either path carries risk. There's no safe option once you have ruled that long, that tightly, and that far past the point where honest feedback still reaches you. There is a deeper personal layer to this as well. A leader in this position is not just protecting an empire or an ideology. He is protecting a family, a legacy, people close to him who could face serious consequences if the wrong person ends up taking power afterward. That adds enormous pressure to every decision, and it explains a lot of the strange, rigid behavior we see from the very top of Russian leadership right now. What makes this even more unstable is the growing gap between loyalty and competence among the people closest to power. Many of the individuals once expected to be trusted allies have reportedly disappointed leadership, not necessarily through open betrayal, but through incompetence, corruption beyond even what is normally tolerated, and a growing disconnect from reality on the ground. When the people around a leader start prioritizing their own survival and personal wealth over the mission they were assigned, that leader's foundation becomes shaky, whether he fully realizes it or not. And this is where the concept of political brittleness becomes so important. When a system depends entirely on one person's judgment, and that person is increasingly isolated from accurate information, the entire structure becomes fragile in a way that is invisible from the outside until suddenly it is not. We are also seeing behavior patterns that historians would recognize instantly as signs of a system entering its final unstable phase. Increasingly extreme domestic crackdowns. People reportedly facing years in prison for something as small as liking a social media post. Attempts to make it illegal to even discuss basic problems like fuel shortages that ordinary citizens can see with their own eyes every single day. When a government starts punishing people for stating the obvious, that is not strength. That is fear disguised as control. This creates a strange self-reinforcing cycle. Nobody wants to tell the leader uncomfortable truths, because delivering bad news is dangerous. So the information that reaches the top keeps getting softened, filtered, and polished until it barely resembles reality. Meanwhile, outside observers, including foreign leaders who still maintain occasional contact, have noted something telling. The value of keeping communication channels open is not diplomacy for its own sake. It is often the only way for that leader to hear anything close to an honest account of what is actually happening in his own country. Some analysts believe this disconnect from reality is not simply strategic performance. It may genuinely be closer to belief. That would explain some of the confusing public statements over the years, confident claims that do not match what independent observers and even his own soldiers describe from the ground. A leader that isolated may not be lying to the public as much as repeating what he has been told by people too afraid to tell him the truth. Perhaps the clearest signal of internal collapse is not political, it is financial. When extremely wealthy individuals who built their fortunes alongside a leader for decades quietly start moving their money and their families out of the country, that is rarely a coincidence. It is usually one of the earliest and most reliable warning signs that insiders no longer believe the system will hold. This is exactly what appears to be happening now. Reports suggest some of the wealthiest and most historically loyal figures connected to Russian leadership have been quietly relocating assets abroad. At the same time, major shareholders in some of the country's largest companies have reportedly been exiting their positions. One of Russia's largest logistics companies, often compared to major global online retailers, reportedly suffered massive financial losses recently, with estimates suggesting billions of dollars worth of goods lost. This company is not just a retail business. It plays a significant role in national logistics, including support functions connected to military supply chains. When a country's own logistics backbone starts absorbing losses at that scale, the ripple effects reach far beyond one company's balance sheet. It becomes harder to move goods. It becomes harder to move military supplies. And when the people closest to the money start pulling their own resources out, it sends a very clear message internally, even if nobody says it out loud. Confidence is fading. It is worth remembering that in any authoritarian system, capital flight by insiders carries a very different weight than capital flight by ordinary citizens. Ordinary people leaving a struggling economy is common and often tolerated. But when the people who built their fortunes specifically because of their closeness to power start quietly protecting themselves from that same power structure, it suggests they know something the general public does not yet fully grasp. These are not people who panic easily. They are people who have spent years learning to read the earliest signs of political danger because their entire survival has always depended on it. Please take a moment right now to smash that like button if this analysis is helping you see the bigger picture more clearly. This channel exists to break down complicated situations into something you can actually understand. not just repeat headlines you have already seen 100 times. Now let's talk about the people who are not sitting in the Kremlin, the ordinary citizens living through all of this every single day. It is easy to assume that if a war is going badly, the general public would know it. But that assumption does not hold up well inside a tightly controlled information environment. Most ordinary citizens, especially those living far from major cities, likely have very limited understanding of how badly things are actually going on the front lines. State television paints one picture. Independent platforms, many of which have been restricted or made illegal to access, would paint a very different one. But without regular access to those independent sources, most people are left with only the version they are told to believe. For someone living in a smaller city or a remote region, disconnected from international news and dependent entirely on state media, the war likely still sounds manageable, even successful in a slow, grinding sort of way. They are simply not being shown the scale of the losses, the fuel shortages, or the economic strain building up behind the scenes. But there is one place where this illusion becomes much harder to maintain: the capital itself. Throughout Russian history, one pattern is repeated again and again. Whoever controls the capital effectively controls the country, and the people living in that capital tend to have more education, more international exposure, more access to alternative information, and a much clearer sense of when something is going seriously wrong. Residents of major cities are increasingly witnessing troubling signs firsthand: sudden internet blackouts during specific hours, airport closures that happen with growing frequency, strange new restrictions that make everyday life feel increasingly controlled and increasingly absurd. Reports have emerged of unusual new rules restricting even small things, like walking pets in certain public spaces, seemingly out of exaggerated security concerns. When restrictions start reaching that level of absurdity, it does not project strength. It projects a government that feels increasingly uncertain of its own control. One particularly revealing example involves air defense systems. Reports indicate that some of these systems have been placed on top of residential apartment buildings in major cities. The stated reason is usually technical. Positioning equipment higher up can extend its detection range and effectiveness. But there is a serious flaw in this reasoning. Placing military hardware on top of civilian housing does not just extend range. It also creates a highly visible target. Modern surveillance and satellite imagery make it relatively easy for an opposing force to identify exactly where these systems have been placed, instead of hiding valuable military assets. This approach can end up highlighting them, sometimes even placing them dangerously close to significant government or security buildings without anyone fully considering the exposure this creates. This points to a deeper issue, a breakdown in coordination and competence at multiple levels of command. There have been numerous documented instances of air defense systems failing to intercept incoming threats, sometimes even striking unintended targets, including infrastructure the systems were supposed to protect in the first place. In one particularly striking case, reports suggest that Russian air defense may have accidentally shot down one of its own advanced fighter jets, one of a very limited number of next-generation aircraft in its fleet. If accurate, that kind of mistake reveals serious problems in command coordination, training, and battlefield awareness, mistakes that should be extremely rare in any well-organized modern military. When command structures start issuing broad, blanket orders instead of precise, well-coordinated instructions, mistakes like this become almost inevitable. Telling defensive units to simply fire at anything flying overhead without proper identification protocols is a recipe for exactly this kind of accident. This is not a new pattern either. Similar tragic mistakes involving overly aggressive, poorly coordinated air defense protocols have happened before in other conflicts, sometimes with devastating civilian consequences. When these kinds of operational failures happen this consistently, at this level of the military, it raises an uncomfortable question. If frontline coordination is this fractured, how much confidence should anyone have in the broader strategic planning happening above it? It is worth pausing here to notice something important about the public statements coming from Russian leadership throughout this war. Rarely do these statements include specific plans, timelines, or strategic reasoning. Instead, they tend to rely on vague, sweeping reassurances, phrases suggesting that the broader objectives of the military operation will eventually be achieved, without ever explaining exactly how or when. That kind of language often signals something important. When leadership cannot articulate a clear path to victory, it may be because no clear path currently exists. Increasingly, many analysts believe that Russia's actual strategy has shifted away from battlefield victory entirely and toward something more political. The real bet appears to be outlasting international support for Ukraine, rather than defeating Ukraine directly through superior military strength. The thinking seems to be that if enough time passes, if enough political fatigue builds among Ukraine's allies, support will eventually weaken or disappear entirely, and Russia can achieve through patience what it has struggled to achieve through direct military force. But here is the problem with betting everything on that outcome. Continuing the exact same military approach that has not worked for years is unlikely to suddenly start working simply because more time passes. If a strategy has not produced decisive results after years of sustained effort, waiting longer while repeating the same approach rarely changes the outcome. Completely different strategy, and there is little evidence that kind of fundamental shift is happening. So the entire long-term plan increasingly seems to depend on external factors outside of Russia's direct control, hoping that international support for Ukraine crumbles on its own rather than winning through military capability. That is an extremely risky foundation to build an entire war strategy around, especially when the opposite trend appears to be happening. Instead of fading, international cooperation supporting Ukraine has continued expanding in scope, funding, and technological sophistication with each passing year of the conflict. All right, before we continue into what could actually trigger a bigger collapse, take a second to subscribe if you have not already, and drop a comment letting me know which part of this analysis surprised you the most. Conversations like that genuinely help this channel grow and reach more people who need to understand this conflict clearly. Let's talk about whether there is realistically any path left for Russia to achieve a major battlefield breakthrough, something beyond just grinding slowly forward, city by city. There was a period earlier in this war when international support for Ukraine was far more limited than it is today. Certain advanced weapon systems were withheld. Some Western nations were even actively discouraging others from providing specific military equipment Ukraine desperately needed. During that early window, Russia arguably had its best possible opportunity to achieve a decisive result while facing comparatively limited resistance. But that window has closed, and closed dramatically. Instead of weakening international resolve, the full-scale invasion appears to have done almost the exact opposite of what was likely intended. Countries that previously maintained strict neutrality joined broader defensive alliances. Nations that had never contributed weapons or support before began actively supplying Ukraine with military equipment, funding, and training. What was meant to intimidate the region, instead, triggered one of the largest expansions of coordinated defensive cooperation in recent memory. Perhaps even more significant than the diplomatic shift is the technological one. Ukraine has used this extended period of conflict to develop, test, and rapidly scale entirely new categories of military technology, particularly in drone warfare. What started as improvised, low-cost solutions has evolved into large-scale domestic manufacturing capability, with estimates suggesting Ukraine could produce millions of drone units within a single year. This kind of production scale fundamentally reshapes the economics of modern warfare. Disproportionate damage using relatively inexpensive, mass-produced technology. This shift matters enormously because it directly counters one of the few tactics that historically gave Russia an advantage in the earliest phase of this conflict: the ability to use disguised, unconventional forces to quietly seize territory without immediately triggering full-scale conventional resistance. In the earliest days of this war, unmarked forces were able to walk into certain government buildings in contested regions, claim to be local separatists rather than foreign soldiers, and effectively take control with minimal resistance. That approach worked specifically because Ukraine, at that time, lacked the conventional and unconventional capability to respond quickly and decisively. That advantage is gone now, and it is not coming back. Ukraine has spent years building exactly the kind of rapid response capability that would prevent that same tactic from working again. Soldiers operating in contested or occupied territories today face a completely different environment than soldiers did in the earliest days of this war. Reports from certain occupied regions describe organized resistance activity, including direct attacks on personnel and equipment, indicating that these areas are no longer passive or fully under stable control. Similarly, reports suggest ongoing covert operations involving intelligence personnel being moved in and out of occupied coastal regions under cover of darkness, further destabilizing any sense of secure control in those areas. All of this points toward the same underlying truth. The conditions that allowed Russia's earlier tactical successes simply no longer exist. Whatever path forward remains, it cannot rely on the same playbook that worked years ago. Any future attempt at destabilization through hybrid or disguised warfare would now run directly into a much more prepared, much more capable defender, one that has spent years specifically learning how to counter exactly these kinds of tactics. So what could actually trigger a much larger, faster collapse, rather than this slow, grinding decline we have been describing? Historically, major military and political collapses often do not happen gradually. They happen suddenly, triggered by one or two critical failures occurring at exactly the wrong moment. We are already seeing early indicators of this kind of vulnerability. Supply lines into certain occupied territories have reportedly been cut off or severely disrupted. Logistics connections to strategically important regions have faced ongoing interruptions. Strikes deep inside Russian territory, including near the capital itself, continue to occur with increasing regularity. Any one of several scenarios could realistically serve as a tipping point, a significant push toward a heavily contested peninsula, a large concentration of troops in a southeastern region finding themselves cut off from adequate food, water, and reinforcement for an extended period. Mass surrenders or large-scale breakdowns in unit cohesion happening simultaneously across multiple locations, or perhaps, most unpredictably, some entirely unforeseen event that nobody is currently accounting for. What makes this especially dangerous for Russian leadership is not necessarily the event itself, it is how that event gets interpreted internally. A battlefield development that looks moderately significant from the outside could be interpreted very differently inside Moscow, as an undeniable signal that the current situation cannot continue without triggering something far worse, potentially even open rebellion within military ranks. At that point, the leadership's long-standing approach of simply waiting for time to fix the problem collapses entirely. The moment enough people decide they are no longer willing to wait and start taking matters into their own hands, that is exactly the kind of moment history shows can end regimes very quickly. And winter adds even more pressure to an already fragile situation. Soldiers who were already struggling with inconsistent food supplies and fuel shortages now face the added burden of surviving brutal winter conditions without adequate cold weather equipment. Financial pressures are mounting as well, with significant debt obligations coming due that will require substantial funding just to maintain basic military operations. If military salaries and financial obligations start going unpaid, that historically tends to accelerate breakdowns in morale and discipline far faster than battlefield losses alone ever could. There is a historical parallel worth remembering here. During the First World War, one major army found itself stretched across an enormous front, suffering catastrophic losses, poorly supplied, and increasingly disconnected from effective central command. That army did not slowly fade away. It fractured suddenly, triggering a much larger political collapse that reshaped the entire nation almost overnight. Military historians have long pointed to that specific collapse as a textbook example of what happens when an overextended, poorly supported military finally reaches its structural breaking point. The uncomfortable truth is that Russian leadership may not be receiving accurate warning signs about how close that same kind of breaking point could be. Reports suggest that instances of soldiers turning against their own commanding officers have occurred with disturbing regularity throughout this war. There have also been persistent reports involving convicted criminals recruited directly into combat units, sometimes even placed into leadership roles, despite having no formal military training or experience. These are not signs of a disciplined, cohesive fighting force. These are symptoms of a system under severe internal strain. Perhaps the most dangerous blind spot of all is communication itself. When individual units reportedly reach out directly, expressing that they are not receiving adequate food or ammunition, and explicitly stating they do not blame leadership personally for the shortages. That might sound almost respectful on the surface. But structurally, that kind of direct complaint moving through unofficial channels represents something far more serious. In traditional military structures, that level of open frustration expressed collectively by extremely serious breach of discipline, bordering on organized dissent. The fact that this kind of communication appears to be happening with growing frequency and largely without serious consequence suggests that command structures may already be losing their grip on unit cohesion in ways that have not yet become fully visible from the outside. This is the real story behind Russia's military struggles right now. It is not simply about losing individual battles or failing to capture specific cities on schedule. It is about an entire system slowly becoming brittle from the inside, weakened by fuel shortages, crushing casualty rates, economic strain, eroding internal trust, and a leadership structure increasingly isolated from the truth of what is actually happening. Brittle systems can hold together for a surprisingly long time, right up until the moment a serious pressure finally hits them. And when that moment comes, the collapse rarely happens slowly. It tends to happen all at once, catching almost everyone by surprise, even the people who saw the early warning signs but never expected them to matter quite this much. Think about how quickly public perception can shift once a crack becomes visible to everyone at the same time. For years, a system can appear stable simply because nobody has tested it hard enough to reveal the weakness underneath. Then one event happens, sometimes something that looks almost minor from the outside, and suddenly everyone realizes the foundation was never as solid as it appeared. That is how brittle systems tend to fail. Not with a long, visible decline that everyone sees coming, but with a sudden, almost overnight realization that the thing everyone assumed would hold has already quietly failed. Nobody can predict exactly when that moment will arrive. It could be a dramatic military defeat. It could be an economic crisis reaching a breaking point. It could be something happening deep inside the walls of the Kremlin itself, invisible to outside observers until the news breaks all at once. But looking at every major indicator together, the fuel shortages, the mounting casualties, the wealthy elites quietly moving their money elsewhere, the increasingly absurd domestic restrictions, and the growing brittleness within military ranks, it becomes difficult to imagine this current system continuing indefinitely in its present form. History has shown us, again and again, that no matter how powerful or entrenched a system appears from the outside, once it becomes brittle enough on the inside, it takes surprisingly little pressure to bring the entire structure down. The only real question left is not whether that pressure will eventually arrive. It is simply a matter of when and what the world will look like the moment it finally does. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really happening behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe. Drop a comment with your own thoughts and share this with someone who needs to see the full picture. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.